They say Rome wasn't built in a day, but what they don't tell you is that plenty of women risked their lives every single day just to keep it running. Not in glamorous ways either. No elegant togas, no marble villas. I'm talking about jobs so brutal, so dangerous, and so quietly ignored by history that you'll wonder how anyone survived long enough to pass on their bloodline. These weren't just bad jobs. These were death sentences disguised as work. And here's the catch. Many of these women didn't exactly choose them. Some were enslaved, others pressured by poverty, and some forced into roles by family or by Rome's ever-demanding appetite for labor. Because if there was one thing the Roman Empire was good at, besides conquering everything in sight, it was chewing people up and spitting them out. And women, they often drew the shortest straws. Take laundresses, for example. Sounds harmless, right? Washing clothes, folding tunics, maybe humming along while scrubbing away, except Roman laundry wasn't clean at all. Women who worked in full onyche, basically ancient laundromats, weren't dunking clothes in fresh water with a dash of lavender soap. They were soaking them in vats of stale urine. Yes, actual human urine, collected from public jars placed on street corners. Because Romans discovered ammonia in pee was the best stain remover. Imagine standing waist deep in that all day with bare skin absorbing chemicals, inhaling toxic fumes strong enough to burn your lungs. Add in slippery stone floors and the constant threat of infection, and being a laundress was less about fabric care and more about slow-motion poisoning. But laundry was almost mild compared to the women working in the tanneries. Ever smelled a modern leather factory? Now strip away modern safety gear, ventilation, and waste systems. Roman tanneries were pits of rotting animal hides smeared with dog dung, urine, and caustic lime. Women were often the ones tasked with scraping fat and flesh from skins, standing ankle-deep in filth while breathing in clouds of hair dust and lime powder. Respiratory collapse, skin ulcers, and permanent blindness weren't side effects. They were job descriptions. And the smell. Let's just say if a Roman woman worked in a tannery, no amount of perfume from the marketplace could disguise it. Still think jobs in ancient Rome were noble. Let's head underground. Women used as miners or ore processors faced a level of danger that makes modern horror movies look like bedtime stories. Most Roman mines were worked by enslaved people. And yes, women were there too. They weren't swinging pickaxes like gladiators, but they were hauling baskets of stone, crushing ore with hammers, and washing out traces of precious metals in icy water until their hands bled. In lead mines especially, women were slowly poisoned. Headaches, miscarriages, and eventual death were guaranteed. Archaeological remains show lead levels in Roman skeletons that are off the charts. Imagine entire work crews slowly losing their minds while Rome built its pipes and coins out of the very poison killing them. Now you might be thinking at least jobs like midwifery weren't deadly, right? Wrong. Being a midwife in ancient Rome wasn't only about delivering babies. It was about doing it with zero pain relief, limited medical knowledge, and a terrifying mortality rate. Roman childbirth was already dangerous. Some estimates say nearly 1 in 4 mothers died giving birth. And the midwives? They were in the splash zone. No gloves, no antiseptics, and no understanding of germs meant infections spread fast. One difficult birth could leave both mother and midwife dead from sepsis. Midwives were also blamed when things went wrong. A stillborn child, accusations of negligence, witchcraft, or worse could follow. It was a job where every shift could end with a burial. And then there were the wet nurses. Picture this. Wealthy Roman families often handed their newborns to poor women to breastfeed and raise in their place. Sounds like steady work, until you realize these women were expected to suppress their own fertility, feed another woman's child instead of their own, and work under brutal schedules. Malnutrition, mastitis, and exhaustion could kill them. Some wet nurses died from sheer depletion. Meanwhile, their own children often went neglected or starved. In other words, their labor nourished Rome's elite while draining the very life out of them. Want to hear something even darker? Women weren't just working for Rome, sometimes they were entertainment for it. Female gladiators, gladiatrices, are rare in records, but they existed, and their job was pure spectacle with nearly guaranteed death. They fought wild animals, they fought men, they fought each other, all for the roar of a crowd that considered their suffering exotic. For most, it wasn't a career, it was a countdown timer. The fact that the Roman Senate eventually banned female gladiators tells you just how extreme the spectacle had become. But here's the job that might top them all: prostitutes registered with the Roman state. You'd think at least sex work meant money, maybe some independence. Not in Rome. Women in brothels were taxed, regulated, and often owned by pimps or the state itself. Diseases spread unchecked, violence from clients was routine, and unlike wealthy courtesans who could leverage connections, most prostitutes were enslaved or desperately poor. Their bodies were tools of commerce, their lives shortened by disease, exhaustion, and abuse. Rome tolerated them because it kept men satisfied, but the women themselves were ground down in one of the deadliest industries imaginable. And we haven't even touched on women working in Roman kitchens, handling boiling oils and open flames in cramped urban blocks that caught fire with alarming frequency, or those in textile workshops, inhaling fibers until their lungs gave out, or the women forced to carry water in endless trips from aqueduct fountains to wealthy households, breaking spines under clay amphorae heavier than some modern gym equipment. Here's the pattern you're probably noticing. Rome thrived because women's bodies were sacrificed to it, not on battlefields with swords and shields, but in laundries, mines, kitchens, bedrooms, and brothels. Silent wars fought with fumes, disease, exhaustion, and impossible demands. Jobs that didn't make monuments or history books, but made Rome function nonetheless. And yet, each of these roles came with its own twist of irony. The laundress slowly poisoned by ammonia. She made the spotless toga senators war to debate the empire's future. The wet nurse starving her own child. She was raising the next generation of Roman aristocrats. The prostitute suffering from disease. She was literally funding the Roman economy through state taxes. Every deadly job women endured was entangled with Rome's glory. If the laundries stank and the tanneries burned your lungs, the brickworks might just break your bones outright. Rome's hunger for construction was bottomless. Aqueducts, bathhouses, temples, apartments crammed in every district. Behind the marvels of Roman engineering were legions of workers, and women were not exempt. Many, especially enslaved women, were tasked with hauling clay, kneading it with bare feet, and carrying loads of wet bricks so heavy they bent spines out of shape. The kilns where bricks were fired reached searing temperatures, and smoke filled the lungs of anyone nearby. Records of skeletal remains from Roman-era cemeteries show the kind of compressed vertebrae and joint damage you'd expect in people who spent a lifetime carrying impossible weight. These weren't gladiators, but their bodies tell a story of constant battle with gravity and heat. And if hauling bricks wasn't enough, some women were tied to Rome's obsession with textiles. Wool was the empire's lifeblood. Every tunic, cloak, and toga began in spinning and weaving workshops, often staffed by women working under punishing conditions. Weaving itself might sound harmless: sit at a loom, pass a shuttle back and forth. But in Rome's full-scale workshops, it meant endless hours bent forward, inhaling dust and fibers until lungs collapsed under chronic bronchitis, or something worse. Even the Roman poet Juvenal described the coughs and weakness of women chained to the spinning rooms. These weren't just coughs you slept off. Textile dust builds up like cement in the lungs, slowly turning breath into wheezing, then into silence. Of course, some women weren't locked in workshops or laundries. They were dragged into public baths, not as bathers, but as attendants. Roman baths were the pride of the empire, places of relaxation, gossip, and politics. But for the women hired or enslaved to maintain them, it was a battlefield of burns and disease. Fires heated the hypercoarse systems under the floors, creating temperatures high enough to scald skin instantly. Bath attendants carried massive jars of boiling water, poured oils for massages, and scrubbed floors slick with filth. Skin diseases spread like wildfire in these damp, crowded spaces, and the women who worked there had no choice but to breathe it all in. Imagine working 12 hours in a sauna without breaks, only with strangers constantly coughing, spitting and bleeding into the water you had to clean. And while we're on the subject of things nobody wanted to clean, Roman streets. The empire boasted advanced aqueducts and sewers, but let's not romanticize it. Many parts of the city were clogged with waste, and someone had to move it. Women, especially enslaved ones, were sent to carry out the dirtiest of all tasks, carting human and animal waste to disposal sites. Latrine attendants and dung collectors lived in permanent contact with disease. Dysentery, cholera, and parasites weren't just risks, they were inevitabilities. For pay so low it could barely feed them, these women gave their health so the city's wealthy never had to smell their own filth. Then there were the entertainers. We already touched on gladiatrices, but that wasn't the only dangerous stage in Rome. Female performers, dancers, acrobats, even musicians, were often pushed into acts that risked injury or worse. Rope walkers fell, fire performers burned, and the constant demand to outdo the last spectacle meant pushing limits until bones broke. Unlike gladiators, these women weren't celebrated for bravery. They were treated as disposable novelties. If one died in a fall, another was waiting in the wings. The crowd didn't mourn, they cheered louder. But maybe no job highlights the contradiction of Rome more than being a nursemaid in plague years. When epidemics swept through the city, measles, smallpox, or the mysterious Antonine Plague, rich families needed someone to care for their children. Enter poor women hired for pennies to nurse sick children who might infect them. Without understanding contagion, these women worked face to face with disease that ripped through entire populations. Some didn't even make it a week before joining the funeral processions clogging the streets. And yet, when a child survived, the credit went to the gods, not the nurse who risked her life. Even seemingly domestic work came with lethal twists. Take food preparation. Women in kitchens of wealthy houses handled knives, open flames, and boiling vats with no safety gear. Oil fires were common, and Rome's tightly packed insulae, apartment blocks, went up in flames like matchsticks. A kitchen accident wasn't just a burn scar, it could level an entire building and leave cooks charred in seconds. And the drinking water? Women who carried it weren't sipping clean, fresh mountain spring. Lead pipes delivered water laced with toxins. Amphorae filled at fountains grew heavy with each trip, crushing shoulders and hips. Imagine carrying 30 kilograms of sloshing clay jars dozens of times a day. It was a workout designed by someone who hated humanity. Many women collapsed from hernias or joint failure before reaching old age. The brutality of Roman work wasn't just physical, it was psychological too. Though Rome wouldn't have used that word. Women sold into brothels, for example, weren't just dealing with disease and violence, they were stripped of identity. Prostitutes had to register, pay taxes, and wear specific clothing to mark them as sex workers. There was no pretending, no blending in. Every street corner reminded them of what they were forced into, every insult from passers-by confirming it. The state profited from their suffering while branding them as morally corrupt. In a way, it was a job where death might have felt like the only escape. And here's a twist. Many don't expect poison making. Some women in Rome were accused, rightly or wrongly, of working with herbs and toxins, sometimes as healers, sometimes as clandestine abortion providers, sometimes as hired poisoners. It was deadly both ways. Handling plants like hemlock or wolfsbane without gloves could be fatal. But the real danger came from accusations. Roman law came down hard on women suspected of poisoning, whether they were midwives trying to help a desperate woman, or someone framed for political convenience. A single whispered rumor could lead to public execution. In other words, the job of healing with plants carried the risk of death from the plants themselves and from the state's paranoia. Even temple work, which sounds serene, could grind women down. Vestal virgins are often painted as Rome's most privileged women, untouchable priestesses with power and influence. but their lives were more prison than paradise. Taken as children, bound by vows of chastity for 30 years, they faced punishment so extreme, they sound like horror fiction. Break your vow, you were buried alive. Make a mistake during a ritual, the entire city blamed you for angering the gods. It was a job cloaked in white robes, but under them was the constant knowledge that one slip could mean the end, slowly in the dark, with the city's scorn above you. And all of this, from laundresses drowning in urine fumes to priestesses suffocating underground, wasn't exceptional. It was daily life. Rome's greatness was built on the backs of women whose labor came with hidden death warrants, stamped not in ink but in shortened lifespans, crippled bodies and silent graves. If temple service could bury you alive, the circus could tear you apart in front of thousands. Women attached to the circus weren't always fighters. Some were stagehands, attendants, or even part of the teams that handled exotic animals. Picture yourself leading lions or leopards out into the arena, with nothing but a rope, no tranquilizers, no cages, just a wooden barrier between you and a predator that hadn't eaten all day. One slip, one bad moment, and the crowd got a bonus performance, your death. Records mention beast handlers as some of the most expendable workers in Roman entertainment, and women were among them, expected to feed, clean, and parade animals that saw them as prey. Even when the animals weren't tearing people apart, the circus was a furnace of accidents. Horse grooms, many of them women working in stables, lived surrounded by stampeding chariots, hooves, and constant crashes. Every race meant injuries, and someone had to pull broken bodies and panicked horses off the track. Grooms inhaled dust, got kicked, trampled, and sometimes dragged into the chaos themselves, and all of it was considered just part of the show. Meanwhile, Rome's obsession with beauty demanded another hidden army of women, cosmetic workers. It might sound like pampered work, making powders, mixing perfumes, preparing creams for elite matrons, but the recipes, that's where the danger lay. Lead-based makeup was everywhere, mixed by hand. Mercury compounds were used in skin treatments. Women who worked in these cosmetic trades poisoned themselves daily, smoothing toxins onto other people's faces and inhaling the dust. Some scholars argue that workers handling cosmetics absorbed so much lead and mercury, they aged decades before their time. What the wealthy saw as glamour was, for the women producing it, slow chemical warfare against their own bodies. And then there were the mosaic grinders. Ever admired those intricate Roman floors with shimmering tiles? Behind every one was someone smashing rock, glass, and marble into tesserae. Women, often enslaved or poor laborers, spent hours striking stones into shards, inhaling glass dust that cut through their lungs and throats. Even today, glass dust is notorious for causing silicosis. Imagine centuries ago, with no masks, no ventilation, nothing but hammer and rock. Their hands blistered, their eyes filled with fragments, and their lungs hardened until they could barely breathe. Yet the finished mosaics ended up decorating villas where senators walked barefoot, never seeing the broken women who made them. But some of the most perilous tasks weren't in cities at all. They were in agriculture. Roman estates stretched across the empire, feeding millions, and women were in the fields just as much as men. Harvesting grain meant hours under the burning sun, with scythes and sickles, where a slip could slice through fingers or worse. Vineyards were another trap. Women stomped grapes in vats swarming with insects, dealing with rot, fungal infections, and infections from constant cuts on their feet. Even beekeeping, which Romans practiced widely, was far from the peaceful pastoral image. Women tending hives suffered stings by the dozens, allergic reactions, and swollen airways, all for honey that sweetened the tables of Rome's rich. And don't forget the fish markets. Rome adored its garum, a fermented fish sauce poured on everything. But producing it meant working with barrels of rotting fish, fermenting in the sun until the smell could knock you unconscious. Women working in garum factories stirred the vats, strained the liquid, and hauled the heavy amphorae to market. The fumes weren't just unbearable, They carried bacteria and parasites. Archaeologists describe garum workshops as so foul that entire neighborhoods stank of death. Imagine spending your entire life elbow deep in decaying fish guts, just so an aristocrat could drizzle sauce over his oysters. Some women found themselves bound to firework-like trades that burned out even faster. Lamp making, for instance. Oil lamps were everywhere in Rome, homes, temples, streets. Women who shaped and filled them handled toxic fumes from burning oils and resins. Add to that the ever-present risk of explosion when oil ignited, and the job became a game of Russian roulette. Archaeological digs show lamp makers' shops blackened with soot and collapsed from sudden fires. For the women inside, one mistake with a flame meant they were gone before anyone could even shout. Even in medicine, where you'd think women might find safer roles, the reality was bleak. Female healers and herbalists often took on the dirtiest, most desperate cases men refused. Festering wounds, contagious illnesses, childbirth gone wrong. With no knowledge of sterilization, they were constantly exposed to diseases that could wipe out entire towns. Handling blood, pus and vomit wasn't just thankless, it was deadly. And while male physicians could sometimes shield themselves with status, women healers carried double risk: the illnesses themselves and accusations of witchcraft if their treatments failed. A cough could kill them, a rumor could too. Even burial work fell on women's shoulders in certain parts of the empire. Death was constant in Rome. Plagues, wars, accidents, and corpses needed tending. Enslaved women were sometimes sent to wash bodies, prepare them for cremation, or carry them to tombs. Handling the dead without understanding contagion meant they were direct targets for disease. The irony is brutal. Women already worked in jobs that killed them young, and some ended up preparing the dead before becoming corpses themselves. The deeper you look, the clearer it becomes. There was no safe sphere of work. Even domestic service, which many imagined as simple cleaning or childcare, was its own gauntlet. Women scrubbing mosaic floors inhaled lime powder that scarred their throats. Those tending braziers breathed in coal dust. Carrying water up 10 flights of wooden stairs in an insula wasn't just exhausting. Those buildings collapsed so frequently that whole families were buried alive, servants included. Domestic work wasn't free from danger, it was just invisible. And if none of these jobs killed a woman outright, the constant physical strain almost guaranteed early death. Archaeologists studying Roman skeletons have found women with spines ground down like millstones, knees permanently deformed from kneeling, and teeth worn away from holding tools in their mouths. Every bone tells a story that Rome itself didn't bother to write down. If carrying water broke backs and handling corpses spread disease, quarry work crushed everything in between. Rome's appetite for marble was insatiable. Temples, baths, even floor tiles demanded stone cut from quarries that swallowed entire hillsides. Women in these spaces weren't quarry masters. They were the endless carriers. Buckets of rubble, baskets of broken shards, hauling away debris from men chiseling blocks. Quarries were death traps. Rocks slid without warning, ropes snapped, carts overturned. And when heavy stones crushed a worker, the only replacement Rome needed was another body, usually another enslaved woman. The marble glistened white in temples, but it was carried there on bruised shoulders. But even more insidious than quarries were mills. Grain mills powered by animals, water, or even human strength were central to feeding Rome's swollen population. Women, especially enslaved ones, were forced to turn heavy millstones by hand, walking endless circles, their joints grinding as much as the grain itself. Day and night, round and round, their bodies became machines. Knees gave way, hips locked, and exhaustion toppled them mid-stride. Archaeologists have found grooves worn into stone floors where women's feet walked the same path until they dropped. It's not just back-breaking work, it was literally life-wasting work, grinding the body down grain by grain, and the bakeries that followed weren't safer. Ovens in Rome burned hotter than any modern kitchen, fed by endless logs, with smoke choking small rooms. Women mixed dough in troughs the size of bathtubs, hauling flour in sacks so heavy they tore muscle and bone. Burns from ovens were inevitable, and fires were frequent. In a city built of wood and cramped tenements, one bakery spark could ignite an entire block. The bread on Roman tables came with a cost hidden in the blistered skin of the women who baked it. Medicine's darker edge stretched into dentistry and mid-level surgical roles too. Some women worked preparing tools or assisting male physicians. Without antiseptic knowledge, their job was to wash bloodied instruments in water and reuse them. That meant blood-borne disease was everywhere. Hepatitis, tuberculosis, parasites, all invisible killers lurking on the surface of knives and probes. Every wash, every touch, every shift was a roll of dice where infection spread like wildfire. And then came dye work, the glamour trade that smelled like a corpse pit. Purple, Rome's prized imperial color, came from murex snails. Extracting the dye was a nightmare. Thousands of snails had to be crushed, their glands scraped out and fermented in vats. Women working these dye shops handled barrels reeking so badly ancient writers compared them to death itself. Breathing that stench for hours every day wasn't just nauseating. It carried bacteria, triggered chronic respiratory collapse, and left workers permanently marked by the smell. Some dye workers were so saturated with the scent that neighbors could identify them from streets away. And Rome loved the color so much, they kept producing it, no matter how many women the process destroyed. Another deadly niche was glass-blowing workshops. Not all workers blew the glass. Many women helped prepare sand, handle molten furnaces, and polish finished pieces. Imagine standing in a furnace-lit room with no ventilation, breathing silica and toxic fumes, hands singed by heat radiating from glowing liquid glass. Explosions were common, shards embedding in skin and eyes. The shining goblets that wealthy Romans admired came at the price of eyesight, scars, and shattered bodies. Even Rome's theater industry hid its deadliest tasks backstage. Women employed as costumers or prop handlers spent hours dyeing fabrics with dangerous chemicals, carrying oversized wooden scenery, and rushing around open flame torches that lit the stage. Fires swept theaters more than once, consuming workers who had no escape routes. And unlike actors, whose names occasionally survived, these women were faceless, forgotten stagehands, their deaths erased as quickly as the sets they moved. Let's not skip rope making, either. Sailors and soldiers demanded endless ropes, nets, and rigging. Women in rope workshops twisted fibers into strands, working in clouds of dust and tiny splinters. Each breath carried plant fibers that lodged in lungs, building scar tissue until breath came only in shallow gasps. Rope-burned hands, bent spines, and constant coughing marked the trade. And because the Navy devoured rope in bulk, the pace never slowed. Metalwork added yet another layer of poison. While men forged weapons, women often worked the smaller, repetitive tasks, polishing, riveting, or shaping ornaments. The fumes of lead, tin, and bronze filled workshops. Lead especially seeped into their blood, causing neurological damage, miscarriages, and an early grave. Some historians argue that Rome's widespread use of lead in pipes, cookware, coins, and cosmetics shortened lifespans across society. But for the women trapped in the workshops, it wasn't just society's decline, it was daily, intimate poisoning. And in the markets, there were sellers of herbs, fish, bread, or oil, but each stall carried hidden threats. Oil merchants constantly risked burns from spilled amphorae. Herb sellers often handled poisonous plants without gloves, not realizing the danger. Fishmongers gutted catches on open tables, swarming with flies, slicing fingers open, while disease seeped in. Market women were exposed to everything from tetanus to food poisoning. Surrounded by refuse the city never fully cleared, the bustling, lively forum was also a breeding ground for infections that ended lives as quickly as a sword. Even water carriers tied to Rome's fire brigades lived on a knife's edge. Fires erupted daily in crowded insulae, and enslaved or hired women rushed with buckets of water, climbing stairs, dodging collapsing beams. When walls gave way, they had nowhere to run. Firefighting wasn't a civic service, it was survival work, and women in these roles bore the brunt of Rome's endless accidents, only to be forgotten when the flames died out. Then there was pest control. Rats, insects, and snakes infested Rome, especially in grain stores. Some women were sent into granaries to scare off vermin or clean out infested stores. Grain dust filled their lungs like sandpaper, while rat bites and snake strikes added immediate dangers. Granaries were known to collapse, suffocating workers under tons of grain. Picture suffocating, not from drowning, but from an avalanche of wheat burying you alive. For some women, that was how the workday ended. And if none of that ended a life, disease almost certainly would. Women in nursing roles, in plague houses or military camps, cared for the sick without barriers. They cleaned sores, changed bedding soaked in blood, and breathed the air of smallpox patients. They weren't honored as martyrs. They were simply the unseen dead when plagues subsided, their lives erased by the same epidemics they struggled to fight.